Hello, Corey. Thank you. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Pascal. It's good to see you.
It's you too. I hope my intro did you justice. So, Corey, I'm interested in this fat formulation of Jewish politics, and I'm looking at it as the same way I look at the formulation of black politics, which is maybe why I'm a little hesitant to look at it because when I discuss black politics nowadays, I ask, is there a justification to have a quote unquote black politics in light of the fact of how badly black politics has served the interests of the black community? What exactly is the merit, if you will, to staying with that titular name of Jewish politics? What are your arguments to that?
Well, I mean, I think the merit, you've sort of hinted at it already, is that in the discourse, oftentimes the Jewish community is represented as a single unitary community, and with a single spokesperson, or a single organization that represents them. And one of the reasons why I mean, I didn't come up with the title, but the reason that I think it's helpful is that in a certain way, that was very much the style of how the Jewish community dealt with politics in Europe, um, going back a long, long way. Um, it was represented as a singular community. Oftentimes, in modern states, had an official Jewish organization that was authorized by the state to speak for the Jewish people to the state, and it was a very elitist brokerage model of politics. And one of the reasons why it's helpful to name it that way is that that was very different from how Jews began interacting with the state and with politics in the United States, really going back to the Revolutionary era. So the main value I think about the term is is that it captures something about the European experience of Jews, but shows that when we talk about Jews in the United States this way, this is very different from historically how Jews had gone about engaging in politics. And we could talk more about what that was. But I think that's the primary value of the term, is that it shows it's a kind of European orientation, a very old world orientation that a lot of American Jews broke with.
Right now, that's interesting because there are elements of the black working class that we have in America that are still using that brokerage model,
Yeah,
and unfortunately have not found a way to the independent kind of position. Because I actually argue that the utility of having that kind of model is obsolete altogether,
yeah,
frankly, completely. Particularly in terms of trying to argue that you represent 14% of the population, which is when Jews are only what 2% of the population, and it's
yeah,
hard enough to do it with them.
right,
Can you imagine doing it with 14%?
right.
But can you talk more about the formulations of what the
Sure.
uh, that, two models of Jewish politics traditionally have been?
Sure. So, I mean, I think when people think about Jews in politics or Jews in the state in the long run of history, you oftentimes have this notion that Jews were always this oppressed people. They were always beaten down by the state. They were always marginalized. They were always subjugated. That's at least the kind of conventional way Jews tell their own stories to themselves, and it's often the way Jewish history is depicted by others, by non-Jews. The truth is that, and this goes actually back to antiquity, so even before Europe emerges as a form, Jews always, for a lot of complicated reasons that we don't have to go into, but um, did use this brokerage model. You see this actually going back to the book of Genesis. Remember the story of Joseph. Joseph is one of the patriarchs of the Jewish people, and he is very close with Pharaoh. And in fact, there's this little part of the story that doesn't get a lot of attention, neither in synagogues or churches, nor in the musical about Joseph and his magic Technicolor Dreamcoat. but he was so close with Pharaoh that he in dealing with the famine that Egypt was dealing with, ancient Egypt, he basically comes up with a plan to slowly divest Egyptian peasants of their land, their currency, their wealth, and ultimately their labor, effectively making them serfs of the state. And so this is a model of how, that's a religious story, but you also see it in secular texts as well, going back to about how Jews in Alexandria dealt with. It's a very elite driven model where you have a kind of figure that's very high up in the Jewish community, that's very close to the sovereign, whether it's Pharaoh in Egypt, or later the Roman emperors or things like that, and is able to kind of protect his community by making deals and providing services to Pharaoh, but often separating and keeping the community at a distance from other oppressed groups. And this is a tradition that continues into Europe during the Middle Ages and into the early modern era. And there's a term that I use in the piece, it's a famous term from history, the court Jew. During the early modern era, monarchs are looking for looking for resources to finance their wars, increase their financial base, and these court Jews play that service. And in return, they get protection for their community, special protections for their community. So that's the one model, and it's a very elite brokerage model, and it's very European. When Jewish people come to the United States, they instantly are thrown into a very different situation. Um, it's first of all, it's a much more pluralistic experience. There's no unified Jewish community. There wasn't really in Europe either, but there's certainly none in the United States. And Jews find themselves beginning to make alliances with other oppressed religious minorities, the Huguenots in South Carolina, most famously. Um, and they start petitioning for rights, not just on behalf of themselves, but in coalition with other groups, and are able to pioneer this coalitional model of politics. That is both specific to to Jewish people, but also in alliance with non-Jews as well. And this develops throughout the 19th century. I mean, one of my favorite stories, actually going back to the 18th century, is during the celebrations of the ratification of the Constitution. In Philadelphia, Jewish groups march with other groups to celebrate the ratification of the Constitution, and at the end there's a festive meal. And the Jewish community, the Jewish group in Philadelphia, what they do is, they march with these other groups, and then they have their own table at the meal with kosher food. And it's a nice story to me because it shows the ability to be both particular on the one hand, but also in alliance and coalitional and even universal on the other hand. And that's very different, I argue in the piece, from the European experience. And the culmination of this kind of coalitional politics is, of course, the alliance between, and one can get very romantic and misty-eyed about this, but the fact of the matter is there was an alliance between blacks and Jews in the civil rights struggle. And it wasn't because Jews were like just good people and just thinking about black people because, they're just altruistic. It was because Jews saw that the only way to have protection for Jewish people was to live in a full and complete democracy. You had to have full rights and freedoms for everyone. And so many Jews saw the Brown decision as the culmination of a Jewish dream, which was to live in a full and integrated society where you could be both Jewish and a citizen. And again, that's a very different model from Europe. And so the punchline of the piece is that today, I mean, it's not just today, it's been developing over the last 40 to 50 years. Jews have really begun to move away from that more democratic, pluralistic model. And instead, we're reverting back to this European model where we turn to organizations like AIPAC, and look to both Republicans and Democrats to protect us. And so you get, these, really idiotic situations where you have the Republican Party, which has, many openly anti-Semitic people in it, proclaiming their allegiance to the Jewish people because they love the state of Israel so much. That's an obvious story. More troubling to me is when you get people like Joe Biden saying things like to the Jewish organization leaders, he said it multiple times. You know this in your guts. When push comes to shove, it doesn't matter how committed and involved you are in the American democratic project. What ultimately is going to protect you is the state of Israel.